On that October morning, the bells of London did not simply ring. They screamed, cannons thundered from the tower, and the smoke of gunpowder curled over the rooftops like incense, offered to a vengeful god. After nearly 30 years of waiting, of divorces and executions, to have broken oaths and broken churches, King Henry VIII finally believed his dream had come true. Jane Seymour, his pale and patient queen, had laboured for 12 brutal days, and the cries echoing from her chambers signalled that her agony had produced a child. The whole court held its breath. Henry dropped to his knees, tears streaking his face, convinced that God had forgiven him at last. He had suffered, he had sacrificed, he had burned bridges and burned men. But now, surely, he had been rewarded. Surely. This was his son. Then the midwife whispered, "It's a girl." Not cheers followed, no triumphant announcement, no chorus of voices shouting a prince as Henry had dreamed in his most righteous visions. Just silence thick, cold, and suffocating. The air turned heavy with something unspeakable. In the birthing room, Jane Seymour reached out with a trembling hand for the gaze of her husband, the man for whom she had bled and nearly died. But the king did not meet her eyes. He stared instead at the infant whole, healthy, and utterly wrong. A daughter, not a son. And 12 days later, Jane died of childbed fever, her body drained and her soul spent. Henry lost the only woman he ever claimed to truly love, but the grief was not enough to mask his deeper despair. The child she left him was not Edward. The name he had prepared, the destiny he had envisioned, now had no vessel. The child would be named Jane, but no name could change the truth. She had been born to take the place of a boy who had never been, and from that moment on, the kingdom began to fracture. The king's mind, already plagued by guilt and infection, spiraled into shadows. He believed God was punishing him, that the break with Rome, the blood on the scaffold, the shrieking fires at Smithfield, all of it had been for nothing. He had 3 daughters, no sons, 3 living reminders that his dynasty teetered on the edge of ruin. Mary, the solemn Catholic, who clung to her mother's rosary like a shield. Elizabeth, sharp as glass, born of a wife he had called a witch. And now, baby Jane, the only legitimate child, the only one not bastardized by Parliament but still just a girl. A king with 3 daughters and no sons was not a king blessed by heaven. He was a king cursed, marked, already rotting in spirit, even as his body festered. What followed was not just chaos. It was a war fought in whispers and courtly smiles, a descent into madness dressed in silks and scripture. The Howards' staunch Catholics pressed for a new queen from Europe, someone pious enough to cleanse the royal line. Meanwhile, Thomas Cromwell, Henry's razor-tongued minister, knew his own survival hung on finding a Protestant bride. He proposed Anne of Cleves, and that misstep was his death sentence. When Henry laid eyes on her and recoiled in disgust, it was not disappointment, he felt it was betrayal. Rage, a sacred fury that only a man convinced of divine wrath can summon. Cromwell, who had dismantled the monasteries and remade England's soul, was dragged to the block, not merely for failing to please the king, but for failing to save him. Henry unravelled further, clutching at youth like a drowning man snatching weeds. He married Catherine Howard, young, vibrant, and full of laughter. She gave him the illusion of joy, of masculine pride restored. But when her past lovers were exposed, and she was condemned for treason, her death struck him not just as a betrayal, it was a sign, a message. God had abandoned him. 6 wives, 3 daughters, no sons. He limped through the final years of his reign like a ghost that hadn't realized it was dead. And when he did finally die, in the year 1547, He was no longer the great lion of England, he was a grotesque shadow. Bloated, festering, swaddled in stinking linens, raving about betrayal, about prophecy, about the son he had never held, his will confused, contradictory, paranoid, named Mary first, then Elizabeth, then the infant Jane. It was a line of succession not designed for unity, but for civil war, a legal suicide note. And when he exhaled for the final time, Henry did not leave behind a kingdom. He left behind a lit fuse. 3 sisters, 3 religions, 3 armies in waiting. From the moment the midwife said, "It's a girl," England was no longer the country we remember. There would be no Gloriana, no Virgin Queen, no Elizabethan Golden Age, no sonnets by Shakespeare, no armada vanquished by winds and fire, no roaring sea dogs like Drake claiming new worlds in the Queen's name. All of that vanished, erased by one whispered sentence in a blood-soaked chamber. And it all began with a cry, not of a prince, but of a princess. In the weeks following the death of Jane Seymour and the quiet, tremulous birth of Princess Jane, the halls of Hampton Court lost their music. The laughter, once constant and gilded with pageantry, fell silent. The footsteps of courtiers echoed too loudly against the stone floors. And when Henry VIII passed by, no one dared meet his eyes, not because of fear alone, though fear always lingered like a shadow at his feet, but because there was something new behind those eyes, something that unsettled even the most hardened of men. It was not madness. Though some whispered that word, it was not sorrow alone, though that weighed on him like the lead buckles of his robes. It was the hollow look of a man who had held the keys to eternity in his hands, only to watch them melt into ash. For a time, Henry did not speak of the infant princess. He visited her chamber once, stood over the cradle, where the wet nurse rocked the child, and stared long and hard at the soft curve of her cheek, the fine red hair that shimmered like her dead mother's in the candlelight. Then he left, saying nothing. He never returned. Instead, he threw himself into the hunt, not of deer, but of answers. He questioned God in his private prayers, then berated his bishops when they failed to supply divine reasoning. He ordered new translations of old prophecies. He scoured the scriptures for signs he might have misread, that somewhere amid the parchments there had been a verse he had misunderstood, a moment he should have turned left instead of right. He demanded the finest painters of the land sketch him in the full glory of kingship, as if a painted son might redeem the fleshly one he lacked. But no artist could fill the throne beside him, and even the grandest portrait, thick with gold leaf and crimson velvet, they could not silence the whisper that grew louder in the corners of court. He had lost the game of sons. Yet for all the silence that followed Jane Seymour's death, the country did not sleep. Beneath the polished floors of Westminster and the thick tapestries of Greenwich, a tremor began. The factions that had once seemed buried rose again, like weeds through cracked stone. The Catholics, emboldened by Henry's visible despair, urged him to return to the fold of Rome. They argued that his punishment was not coincidence, but divine justice. The Protestants, fearful and cornered, urged action, more reform, more purity, more breakage from the old ways. And in the middle of this rising storm stood 3 girls, 3 daughters, 3 symbols. Mary, the eldest, nearly full grown, walked in the world like a ghost, with a rosary in her hand. Her eyes had long since learned the lesson of watching silently from the shadows, of bowing when needed, of praying when ignored. Yet her faith, quiet as it seemed, was like stone. She had been told she was a bastard, disinherited, erased from the succession, but she had not broken. Instead, she waited. She watched the realm shift around her, and she waited. Elizabeth, younger, quicker, far more dangerous, was not a ghost, but a flame. She read Latin at 5, debated theology by 7, and moved through the court like a fox in a hen house, graceful, sharp, always listening. Henry did not speak her name aloud often, but he did not forget her. There were moments when she reminded him too much of her mother. The tilt of the chin, the knowing smile, the way she could disarm a room with a question. These things unsettled him. And so Elizabeth, too, was kept to the margins, not cast away, but never embraced. Her sharpness frightened men. Her mind was a blade they feared might one day point inward. And then there was the youngest, the one who had been born too late to mean anything, and too early to be dismissed. Jane, the baby, the last echo of hope now turned complication. The girl with the name of a dead queen, and the legitimacy of a crown, but none of the power to wield it. She grew up with nurses and tutors, not with sisters. She was doted upon in public and largely ignored in private, a symbol without substance. Yet even as a child, Jane had the eyes of someone who had been watched too long. She learned to smile before she could speak, and to curtsy before she could run. And in her presence, courtiers bowed, not for who she was, but for what she might one day become. Time passed, but not quietly. Henry remarried. He always remarried. Anne of Cleves came and went in a gust of disgust and political failure. Catherine Howard danced into the king's favour with a young woman's charms, and died beneath the axe not long after. Her past sins brought forth like evidence at a trial. Heaven itself had convened. And then came Catherine Parr, the final queen. The nursemaid, the scholar, the glue holding together what remained of a fractured royal household. In our history, she was stepmother to one son. In this one, she was mother to 3 daughters who did not love each other and had no reason to try. Mary, the pious; Elizabeth, the threat; Jane, the child with a crown-shaped shadow above her cradle. Catherine saw what others did, not what the king refused to confront. That these girls, no matter their station or faith, would one day be pitted against one another, like lions in a ring, and the kingdom would bleed from whichever throat was torn open first. When Henry VIII finally died, in the year 1547, England did not rejoice, nor did it mourn loudly. It paused, a collective breath drawn and held. The will he left behind was a tangle of contradictions and terrors. Mary first, then Elizabeth, then Jane. A line of succession, not designed to endure, but to unravel. He had refused to choose a single daughter. He had chosen all of them, and in doing so, chosen none. The Privy Council, those old men who once bent the king's will into law, now bent over maps and lists of allegiances, trying to calculate which queen would rule, and which would fall, and so, as the bells tolled for the dead king, 3 queens in waiting stood on separate shores of the same storm. Mary, whose faith was stronger than any crown; Elizabeth, whose mind could cut like her father's sword; Jane, too young to know what the blood in her veins would cost her; and behind them all, the ghost of a boy, never born, the beautiful prince with red gold hair and solemn Tudor eyes, whose absence haunted the realm more than his presence ever could have. He had no name in this timeline, but he had blood on his hands. Though he had never drawn breath, the realm turned its eyes to the eldest daughter, and the second act of England's sorrow began. The winter that followed Henry's death did not bring peace. It brought silence, the kind of silence that gathers before a storm, cold and charged with the scent of iron and dread. For the first time in nearly 4 decades, England belonged not to a king but to a queen, Mary, the daughter of Catherine of Aragon. The girl who had once slept on straw in a forgotten manor while her father paraded Anne Boleyn through the capital was now sovereign. And yet, even as she placed the crown upon her head and let the cheers of the loyal ring through Westminster. There was a fracture beneath the ceremony, because everyone knew, though none dared speak it aloud, that Mary was not the only daughter of the king. She had always known it would come to this, from the moment her father had cast aside her mother and called her a bastard. She had understood that her place in the world would never be secure. Not by birth nor by law, but faith. Faith had given her spine. Faith had given her fire. And now, in the year 1547, that fire had found its way to the throne. But the throne, for all its grandeur, was a cold and lonely place, especially when the shadow of two sisters fell across its marble steps. Elizabeth was the more immediate danger. That much was clear from the start. Sharp of tongue, elegant in bearing, and wrapped in the myth of her martyred mother, she walked the court with the composure of a woman twice her age. She had no army, no crown, no title beyond Lady Elizabeth. But she had something far more dangerous: the people's affection. The reformers whispered her name with reverence. The Protestants looked to her not merely as a Tudor, but as a phoenix who might rise from the ashes of their fallen cause. To Mary, she was not a sister. She was a weapon pointed at the heart of her reign. And yet, in the early days, Mary stayed her hand. She remembered the teachings of her mother: mercy, dignity, patience. Besides, the law was not on her side. Elizabeth had been restored to the succession by their father's will, and despite her supposed illegitimacy, she bore the Tudor blood in her veins just as clearly as Mary herself. But then came the news from Spain. Philip, the son of Charles V, had agreed to marry her. It was the alliance her mother had dreamed of, the joining of two great Catholic houses to bring England back to the true faith. It was a holy mission, and suddenly, mercy no longer seemed so noble. It seemed dangerous. The Protestants rose up in what history would call the Wyatt Rebellion. But in truth, it was not a rebellion. It was a question carved in fire across the land: who would England belong to? Would it fall back into the arms of Rome, or continue down the path Henry had blazed with blood and thunder? Mary knew that if she were to secure her reign, she would need to answer that question with absolute clarity. She would need to extinguish all alternatives, and the clearest alternative wore red hair and walked with the confidence of one already measuring the throne. In our history, Elizabeth was spared. There was no proof, no confession. Her name had been spoken by the rebels, but no direct link could be found. And so she sat in the tower, silent, terrified, and watched by 100 eyes. But ultimately released, Mary had hesitated. She had clung to the fear that killing her sister might break the realm in two, that Elizabeth's death might become a rallying cry for every Protestant nobleman with a sword and a grievance. And so she had chosen caution over blood. But in this world where the baby Jane had been born and had lived, Mary had no such hesitation. There was no longer just one heir beneath her. There were two, and the second, though small and quiet and not yet fully formed as a woman, was Catholic, was legitimate, was moldable, a blank slate upon which Mary could write the future. She did not need Elizabeth, and so she did what she had not dared do in the world we know. She signed the warrant, and with a heavy heart but unshaken conviction, she handed her sister to the axeman. It was not a public spectacle. There were no crowds, no trumpets, no sermons, just a stone courtyard, a block worn smooth by sorrow, and a girl barely 20 years old, dressed in the colours of mourning, walking barefoot through the dawn mist. She did not scream. She did not plead. Some said she whispered a prayer. Others said she looked to the sky and smiled. No one ever agreed. But the blade fell, and the world changed. Elizabeth Tudor, who in our time would become the Virgin Queen, the architect of empire, the patron of poets and pirates, died with her throat resting on cold stone. And with her died England's last chance at balancing fire and faith. The shock rippled through the realm like a scream caught in the throat. Some wept. Some raged. Many simply fell silent. But none dared rise against the Queen, who now ruled not just with the authority of her crown, but with the blood of her sister on her hands. Mary had made her choice. She would cleanse England, not with kindness, but with fire. She would marry her Spanish prince. She would root out heresy wherever it lived. And she would raise the young Princess Jane in the heart of this new Catholic order, this restored vision of righteousness. For Jane, the loss of her sister meant little at first. She was still a child, still clinging to dolls and stories, unaware that her name had begun to circle in the mouths of men as both salvation and threat. But Catherine Parr, who had once tried to hold the girls together like beads on a broken rosary, wept for days. She knew what the future would bring. She had seen how Mary looked at Jane now, not as a niece, not even as a girl, but as a vessel, as a plan, as a reason to kill. Mary pressed forward. She began to burn those who would not convert. Latimer, Ridley, Cranmer. The fires rose higher with every passing month. The people called her Bloody Mary, though not to her face. Her belly swelled once, then twice, with phantom pregnancies that never bore fruit. Her prayers grew louder, her sermons longer, and still the child did not come. But she had Jane. She had a Catholic heir, and as her body failed her, as her husband retreated to Spain and sent only letters in return, Mary turned more and more toward the girl who would inherit the smouldering ruins of her hopes. In the back rooms of the palace, where tapestries muted the sound of footsteps and prayers, Jane was taught not just Latin and psalms, but obedience. She was told of the fires, not to fear them, but to understand their necessity. She learned the names of martyrs, not for inspiration, but as caution. And as the years passed, and her hair darkened, and her eyes grew sharp, Jane began to understand something. Her tutors never spoke aloud one day. She would wear the crown, not as herself, but as the mirror of the woman who had killed to protect her. And so, by the year 1558, as Mary lay in her bed, surrounded by incense and sorrow, the girl who had once been born to disappointment stood waiting in the wings. The world that had lost Elizabeth now looked to Jane. Not the phoenix, not the lioness, but a different creature, entirely silent, watchful, shaped not by ambition, but by survival. And as the crown passed from sister to sister, it left behind only ash. She was crowned beneath grey skies. The rain did not fall, but the clouds hung heavy above Westminster Abbey, like a veil of mourning that refused to lift. There were bells, of course, and the sombre echo of choirs, and courtiers in fur-lined cloaks, lining the nave with stiff, ceremonial pride. But even in their finest silks, the nobles looked more like mourners than celebrants. For this was not a triumphal coronation. It was not a golden ascension marked by destiny fulfilled. It was the quiet inheritance of a girl who had not sought the throne, and whom few believed ready to carry it. The year was 1558, and the new Queen Jane I of England was 20 years old. She had no brothers, no husband, no war trophies, no poetry penned in her honour, and no crowd surging with adoration outside the gates. What she had was a bloodline wrapped in contradiction, a name drawn from the memory of a mother who had died in childbirth, and a crown that had been warmed by the heads of two sisters, one now reviled, the other decapitated, and she wore it not with pride, but with a kind of practiced calm, as though she had learned from an early age that survival was not about brilliance or conquest, but about listening carefully and avoiding the wrong kind of attention. The people did not cheer her the way they had once cheered Elizabeth in the fleeting years before her arrest, nor did they curse her, as they had cursed Mary in her final months of fire and famine. They watched Jane with the weary eyes of a nation that had forgotten what joy sounded like. England had been ruled by women for more than a decade now, but it had not been ruled well. There had been too much burning, too many gallows, too many sermons that spoke of salvation while the air stank of smoke and charred flesh. The land had grown tired of queens and their causes. And Jane Young, quiet, and lacking both passion and promise, was greeted not with resistance, but with resignation. She had been raised within the cold cathedral of Mary's court, beneath crucifixes heavy with gold and Latin, and surrounded by bishops who frowned at laughter. Her tutors had been chosen not for their brilliance, but for their orthodoxy. She could recite the Mass by heart and cross herself with reverent precision, but she had never danced. She had never wandered through the gardens with her slippers off, or raced through the halls with her hair unbound like Elizabeth once had. The Queen Jane who now ascended the throne was not a daughter of passion or politics. She was a daughter of control, and so her reign began not with drums or declarations, but with silence. Parliament was summoned, but there were no great reforms introduced. The alliance with Spain was reaffirmed, though the Spanish themselves barely acknowledged her. Philip, who had never truly loved Mary, sent a perfunctory letter of condolence and a jewelled crucifix, but no offer of continued support. The Habsburgs had little use for a queen who offered no dowry, no sons, and no personal magnetism. Jane, in their eyes, was an extension of Mary's policy, a final, dutiful chapter to be endured, not celebrated. She chose not to marry, or perhaps more accurately, no one chose to marry her. The French sent mocking proposals. The Germans sent silence. The Spanish sent veiled insults wrapped in diplomatic phrases. There were English nobles who might have claimed her hand, but none dared to rise too high lest they fall too hard. The crown was too heavy to touch, and too cold to embrace. Jane, perhaps sensing the danger of false hope, made no move toward courtship. She lived not as a bride in waiting, but as a widow of a future that had died before it began, without a consort, without a son, without a beloved faction to hold her up. Queen Jane ruled alone, though always surrounded by voices of bishops and barons, all whispering their desires in the hollows of her chambers. Her court was an echo of Mary's austere, formal, draped in crimson and gold. Filled with incense and shadows, she reinstated no burnings. Though the laws remained, she did not persecute Protestants actively, but neither did she protect them. Her England was not aflame, but it was cold, the kind of cold that seeps into the bones of a country and teaches it to stop dreaming. And what of the people? They did not rebel. They were too exhausted to rise. They remembered the flames of Oxford, the screams at Smithfield, the men and women who had once sung psalms even as they burned. But under Jane, there were no martyrs, only silence. Silence in the churches, where sermons were recited with careful, measured tones. Silence in the streets, where markets bustled, but no music played. Silence in the hearts of those who had once dared to hope that a golden age would come again. They had hoped once, in Elizabeth, and now she was dust beneath the tower. There were whispers, of course, whispers of what might have been. Old men in taverns still spoke of the princess who had laughed like her mother and argued like her father. Young women still hummed tunes, once sung by minstrels in Elizabeth's brief springtime, but these whispers carried no power. The dead do not rise, and the young queen who now sat on the throne had made no effort to summon ghosts. For a time, this quietness was mistaken for stability. The nobles congratulated themselves on avoiding war. The clergy thanked God that the fires had ceased. The treasury did not overflow, but neither did it collapse. The harvests were average. The ports remained open. The skies held no omens. But it was not peace. It was a hush. A long, uncertain hush. Jane I ruled not with might, nor with majesty, but with absence. Absence of fire, absence of laughter, absence of resistance. The poets stopped writing. The scholars stopped arguing. The dreamers stopped dreaming. And the world looked elsewhere toward the Netherlands, toward France, toward distant shores where younger empires stirred. She reigned for 7 years. Not a long time, but long enough for children to grow into adults without ever knowing the taste of courage or the fire of defiance. And when she died, quietly, without heir, in the year 1565, England did not weep. It merely blinked and moved on. No statues were erected in her memory. No epics were written. Her name did not inspire rebellion or reverence. She was remembered by most as a figure from a cold and colourless chapter. The queen who followed the fire and preceded the frost. The queen whose crown had been passed to her by death and taken from her by silence. And somewhere, in the quiet corners of the realm, beneath that silence, there was a memory not of Jane, but of the queen who should have lived, of the queen who had been killed before her time, whose eyes had once looked to the stars, whose voice had once dared to sing, even when all of England had forgotten the melody. But by then, it was too late. The crown had been passed, the songs had ended, and England, that island of kings and queens, had forgotten how to dream. The crown passed again. This time, not in a blaze of celebration, nor in the thunder of revolt, but like a dying candle handed from one trembling hand to another. When Queen Jane I slipped away in her sleep in the year 1565, no one screamed, no one cheered, and no one ran through the streets with flags. She was not mourned with public grief, nor scorned with public fury. She was simply gone. And England, like a garden overgrown with weeds, swallowed the moment whole. No heir had been named. No child carried her name. No husband lingered at her bedside to whisper prayers into the darkness. The woman who had been born to take the place of a prince, who had ruled not through fire or force, but through caution and restraint, passed into history like morning fog, dissolving into silence. But nature, assever, abhors a vacuum, and so the garden that had once belonged to Henry's blood, to his daughters, and their wars of belief, became once again the battleground for men who saw crowns not as burdens but as weapons. Into this void stepped the nobles, the dukes, the bishops, each sharpening their tongues, each calculating whose blood could still be traced back to the old lines, whose name could still be dragged across a scroll of parchment and declared legitimate by a trembling parliament. There were whispers of the Stuarts in Scotland, cousins with claims tangled in legitimacy and distance. There were murmurs of descendants through Mary's Spanish marriage, though none had ever set foot on English soil. And there were still some who asked, in whispers laced with guilt, what might have happened had Elizabeth lived. But that garden had long been closed. The soil had been salted. The tree had been cut down. Nothing could grow where the sun had been banished. The court fell into disarray. Where once there had been order, now there was hesitation. The clergy spoke cautiously, afraid to bless a name that might not survive the month. The nobles returned to their estates, their letters cold and filled with veiled promises. Even the people in the streets, the butchers, the shoemakers, the women at the wells, spoke of the Queen not as one of their own, but as a ghost who had passed through their lives without ever touching them. Jane had left no mark, not on their hearts, not on their laws, not on their songs. And so they returned to the rituals of bread and toil. And the throne sat empty beneath the looming arches of Westminster, like a sacred relic no longer blessed. Outside the palaces, the world continued its turn. But England was no longer the rising star it might have been. The Netherlands, restless and burning, looked not to England for aid, but to their own. France, reborn in blood and ambition, pressed its fingers into every fragile edge of the continent. And Spain, once a reluctant partner, now looked across the channel, not with brotherhood, but with appetite, for a country that had no queen, no prince, and no policy beyond hesitation. That was not a nation. It was an orchard waiting to be claimed. And still, the English garden bloomed in its way. Though it bloomed without colour, the universities survived. But they did not flourish. The stage remained. But no Shakespeare walked its boards. The seas beckoned. But no daring captains set forth with letters from a queen who inspired courage. There were no great voyages, no golden fleets, no plundered treasure pouring into the veins of London. The ships that left English ports did so for trade, not glory. The pens that wrote did so for record, not legend. It was a nation living in the afterthought of its own potential. There were those, hidden in cloisters and taverns, who still whispered about the years that might have been, about Elizabeth, who had once debated scholars at the age of 10, about the fire in her that had once terrified even her tutors, about how, had she been allowed to reign, the world might have spun differently. They told stories quietly of what England had lost when she was led to the block, head bowed, not in shame, but in inevitability. They imagined an England filled with theatres and sea captains, with letters written in gold and foreign kings who trembled at a queen's name. But in Jane's England, dreams had been folded away like linens in cedar chests. There was no poetry that stirred the blood, no court that dazzled, only a long, muted season where ambition was a risk and vision was a sin. The young remembered nothing else. They grew up without the sound of trumpets or the scent of burning books. Their histories were taught with flat voices and thin ink. They knew that queens had ruled, and that one had been burned, another beheaded, and the last buried with few tears. They did not ask for more, and so the garden continued to grow, unchecked and unsung, filled with hedges, too tall to see beyond, and flowers that bloomed only in the shade. And yet, somewhere in the roots, a memory lingered, a memory of Anne Boleyn, standing defiant at the scaffold, a memory of Elizabeth, laughing beneath the great oaks of Hatfield, a memory of Jane Seymour, pale and bloodied, whispering her daughter's name in the dark. These women, though long dead, had planted something deeper than policy or prayer. They had planted possibility, and though England had chosen silence, the earth remembered. For what is a garden, if not a place where something can begin again? But for now, in the reign after Jane, there was no rising sun, only dusk, long, golden dusk, the kind that seems eternal, until one day, without warning, the night arrives, long after the burial of Queen Jane I, when the incense had faded from Westminster and the nobles had stopped pretending to weep. The problem of succession returned, not as a political question, but as a haunting. England had become a kingdom accustomed to daughters without sons, to queens without consorts, to power that flowed not from lineage, but from accident, tragedy, and compromise. But the people, the crown, the very bones of the land, still hungered for a prince who would rise like the sun and warm the fields, restore the bloodline, cut through the lingering fog of failure that hung over every court and council since Henry VIII had died. But the heirs never came. No one had truly planned for Jane to rule, and even fewer had prepared for the nothingness that followed her. The laws of succession, once scrawled by a dying king desperate to keep control from the grave, had run their course. Mary was gone, buried in a Spanish shroud. Elizabeth had been silenced before her voice ever reached its full volume. Jane had died unwed and childless, and so the line ended not in fire or rebellion, but in a kind of empty sigh. There were no Tudors left to carry the name, only distant cousins, scattered across Europe like seeds, never meant to grow in English soil. The council gathered, once more, grey-haired and grimmer than ever, to find a successor from a family that no longer existed. They drew up charts of genealogy, pointing to branches so thin and tangled that they resembled spiderwebs more than dynasties. There was talk of Margaret Tudor's descendants in Scotland, but the memory of northern wars and the spectre of Mary Queen of Scots turned their stomachs sour. The thought of a Catholic monarch ruling from Edinburgh made the veterans of Mary's fires glance nervously toward the continent. There were whispers of Yorkist blood still trickling through the veins of some quiet nobleman, but such claims smelled of old rebellions, and no one wanted to test fate twice. In the end, there was no clear choice, only lesser fears, and as the council faltered, the foreign crowns circled. Spain sent emissaries with soft voices and hard eyes, suggesting that the widow of Mary's bloodline might remarry into a younger Habsburg cousin and unite the kingdoms once and for all. France, ever cunning, proposed a marriage alliance with one of their princes, offering safety in exchange for submission. Even the Pope sent word, promising papal favour if England would place herself under the guidance of a Catholic house. It was not diplomacy, it was predation. The wolves had tasted the scent of a crippled stag, and they were no longer afraid to bare their teeth. And the English people watched, some in confusion, others in dread. They had endured queens who burned their faith and queens who froze their spirit. They had waited for princes and received silence. They had buried one royal after another. And yet the promises of glory, of greatness, of divine purpose had never been fulfilled. They had lived through sermons and scaffolds, through coronations and executions, through Latin masses and English prayers. But they had never lived through triumph. The common man no longer asked who ruled. He asked if bread would be cheaper. He asked if the sea would bring warships. He asked if his son would be dragged to fight for a queen who would die childless, just like the last. But not all were content to watch the kingdom drift. In the shadowed halls of the old families, in the manor houses where tapestries still whispered the names of Plantagenet and York, ambition began to stir once more. There were boys. Always there were boys, born with half a claim and a full desire. There were girls raised to believe their blood carried magic, even if history had proven otherwise. There were bishops who remembered how to anoint, and men who remembered how to kill. They waited not for law, but for opportunity. They sharpened swords and letters alike. They practiced their bows, and they trained their tongues, and they watched the weather of the realm, knowing that all it would take was a storm to clear the way. But the storm did not come, or rather, it came too slowly. England drifted not toward ruin, not toward glory, but toward irrelevance. The Spanish ships passed in and out of its harbours with barely a nod. The French flirted with war, and then forgot. The Holy Roman Empire treated it as a curious relic, like a once beautiful statue now too cracked to display. There were no great invasions, no great victories. There was only the slow erosion of sovereignty, the kind that does not appear in a single moment, but reveals itself in hindsight, when the songs are quiet, and the maps are redrawn without your name. And still, the people waited. They waited for the prince who would never come. They imagined him. Of course, some said he would be tall, with Henry's shoulders and Elizabeth's wit. Others said he would be gentle, raised in the countryside, unspoiled by court. They told stories of him in the inns, and to the children, a prince in exile, born in secret, waiting to reclaim the throne, a Tudor by blood or spirit, hidden across the sea or in the forests of Wales, training to return. Ali? Perhaps. A fantasy, but one they needed, for a nation without future must invent one, or else it will rot beneath the weight of its past. But deep in the royal vaults, where the air was thick with dust and forgotten prayers, the truth lay untouched. The line had ended, not with a war, but with a cradle left empty. The heirs had never come. The sons had never been born. The crown had passed from mother to sister to silence. And no man had claimed it. Since Henry's breath had stopped, there had been no Edward, no rightful Tudor prince to lift the weight of expectation from so many weary shoulders. And now, it was too late. Because a throne that waits too long to be filled does not stay golden. It begins to tarnish, to rust, to vanish into the mist. And England, the island that once ruled itself with thunder and blood, now ruled itself with silence. It was not the crown, nor the council, nor even the question of who would rule next, that truly marked the decline of England. It was the harbour, there, in the deep bays where great ships once creaked against their moorings and sails flapped like the breath of empire waiting to be born. A stillness had settled. The docks of Dover, of Portsmouth, of Plymouth, all once alive, with the clang of hammer on hull and the shouts of sailors preparing to meet the edge of the world, had grown hushed. The great galleons that had never been built lay only in imagination, in sketches never funnel, in dreams too dangerous for a country afraid of what might lie beyond its shores. England, once an island of ambition, had become a land of caution. Had there been an Elizabeth, had there been a queen unafraid to send men across the horizon, perhaps the age of sails might have begun in these narrow inlets. But the fires of Mary, the silence of Jane, the absence of heirs and the presence of so many whispered doubts had frozen the spirit of exploration before it ever found its wind. There were no Sir Francis Drakes in this England, no sea dogs granted letters of marque, no court poets crafting verses about brave captains and stolen Spanish gold. There were only clerks tallying tariffs, and dockmasters stamping crates of wool and tin. The navy existed, yes, but only in name. Its ships floated close to shore like aging hounds that had forgotten how to hunt. And so the ship never left port, not the metaphorical one that might have sailed toward empire, nor the literal ones that might have crossed the Atlantic before Spain, before France, before Holland. The Americas lay waiting raw, vast, unconquered. But it was not the English who came to claim them. In this England, there was no Virginia named for a virgin queen, no Roanoke carved into legend, to no Jamestown to struggle and rise and burn and rise again. There were no colonies flying the Red Cross of St. George, no taverns in Boston, no Puritan dreams turned into revolutions. The New World belonged to others. England had turned inward, and the sea no longer whispered her name. The poets, if they still existed, had little to write of. They sang not of voyages or queens, but of harvests and hearths. The greatest minds, those who might have flourished beneath a golden court, left for the continent, or simply never awakened. The universities remained, but they echoed with caution, not curiosity. And the court, still draped in gold and crimson, walked in slow processions around itself, unable to decide whether it served a god, a crown, or merely tradition. Without ships to send, without sons to raise, without songs to write, the nation began to settle into the dull ache of routine. The memory of what might have been never truly faded. In quiet corners, it was said in hushed tones that the last daughter of Henry VIII had left the kingdom not empty, but unfinished, that Jane I, in her youth and obedience, had kept the peace. Yes, but at the cost of the nation's pulse, and when she died, without issue, without battle, without fire, she passed on nothing, no legacy, no war, no empire. She had reigned like a candle shielded from wind, and when that flame finally went out, no one moved to light it again. The Scottish question returned. not with fury, but with inevitability. The Stuart line, long feared and long ignored, had persisted. In Edinburgh, there were lords who whispered of destiny, of bloodlines that had once married Tudor to Scottish flesh. Mary, Queen of Scots, though shrouded in suspicion and tragedy, had borne a son. James, he was not yet a man, but he was breathing, and he was male. And England, weary and without direction, could not ignore that forever. In a chamber of whispers and unease, it was eventually agreed James of Scotland would be invited, cautiously, conditionally, to consider the English crown, not because he was beloved, not because he was trusted, but because there was no one else. It was not a coronation but a capitulation, and as James made his slow procession south, under banners, flown more from obligation than devotion, the ports of England watched him pass, not with hope, but with resignation. They knew he would not revive their ships. He was not Elizabeth. He had not seen the flames of Smithfield, nor the cold eyes of the Spanish ambassador, nor the knife poised above his cradle, in a room filled with ambition. He had not bled for England. He had only inherited her fatigue. And though he would wear her crown, it would not shine for him the way it might have for her. The sea remained still, and the ship never left port. There are no great portraits of Jane I. No likeness hangs in the National Gallery. No majestic canvas immortalized by the hand of Hans Holbein or the heirs who came after him. There is no face in oil that commands the gaze of 1,000 schoolchildren. No knowing eyes peering through centuries of dust and reverence. No artist ever painted her standing beside a globe. No royal hand resting on the hilt of empire. No crown caught in golden sunlight on a forehead carved with purpose. There is no rainbow portrait. No armada portrait. No phoenix. No pelican. No jewels woven into allegory. There is only absence. A blank canvas where a queen might have been. And perhaps that was fitting, for Jane never demanded to be seen. She did not dress herself in myth, as Elizabeth once had, nor cloak herself in righteousness like Mary. She reigned in shadows, not because she feared the light, but because she had never been taught to seek it, raised in the quiet corridors of a court built on guilt, shaped by a stepmother who taught survival, not celebration, and haunted by the scent of burning flesh long before she knew what a heretic was. Jane grew into a woman made of silence, and silence does not sit well for painters. The only depictions that remain, if one can call them that are copies of copies, sketches drawn decades later from memory, from speculation, from nothing. A soft chin, a solemn mouth, eyes that might have been her mother's, or her father's, or no one's at all. Historians disagree about even her hair colour. Some say she was fair, others say auburn, others that her hair darkened with sorrow in her later years. But all agree on one thing: she never sat for a portrait. Not once. In an age where rulers carved their identity into brushstrokes and ink, where monarchs wielded imagery as power, Jane I left no mirror behind, only reflection. And what does a nation do with a monarch it cannot picture? It forgets, not all at once. Of course, her name was spoken for a time in the chapels, in the proclamations, in the careful records kept by clerks who knew not to embellish what could not be explained. But as James of Scotland stepped into her absence and made England his own, the memory of Jane faded. Not violently, not vindictively, just softly, a name that slowly stopped appearing on the lips of schoolchildren. A story that no one quite knew how to tell. A figure who had not been a villain nor a heroine, only a placeholder in the shape of a queen. And the poets, oh, the poets never touched her. How could they? There were no sonnets of her court, nor epic victories, nor scandal to romanticize, no tragedies grand enough to echo through time. She gave them nothing to feed on, no Gloriana, No heartbreak. Not martyrdom. She lived. She ruled. She died. And England continued on. Not changed. Not inspired. Only older. But for those who lived in her reign, who walked the grey-tiled halls of her palaces, who saw her seated on her throne with her hands folded like a child, afraid to spill the wine, they remembered something else. They remembered the weight, the unbearable weight of a crown placed on a girl who had never been given permission to want it. They remembered how she listened, how she nodded, how she signed decrees without ever quite making them her own. They remembered her stillness, not regal, but cautious, not confident, but conditioned. They remembered a queen who had been raised not to lead, but to not offend, and that memory, that subtle wound, lingered far longer than any painting ever could. In time, the throne room changed. James filled it with different tapestries, different voices, different ambitions. He brought with him the Scottish air raw, wind-bitten, unfamiliar, and though he reigned in peace, it was not an English peace. It was a peace born of compromise, of diplomacy, of tangled treaties and foreign blood. The Tudor fire had gone out. What remained was something quieter, less certain. The English throne had passed not from mother to son, but from silence to substitution, and in that transformation, something was lost. Not a crown, not a war, but an image, the idea of the monarch as something more than flesh, more than name, the idea that a queen could become myth, could rise above her own mortality and burn herself into the walls of every chamber and the pages of every schoolbook. Elizabeth had done that. Even Mary, in her infamy, had done that. But Jane had not. Jane had been real, too human, too careful, and so the world, as hungry for legend, turned its eyes elsewhere. There is a portrait in the National Portrait Gallery of 3 Tudor queens. It shows Elizabeth in all her glory, flanked by her mother Anne on one side and her cousin Mary of Scots on the other. All 3 are painted with the fervour of remembrance, their gowns impossibly detailed, their eyes aflame with legacy. There is no room in that painting for Jane. She is the ghost standing just outside the frame, watching, listening, waiting for a brush that will never move. And still, she reigns in the silence between pages, in the shadows of portraits never made, a queen with no image, a ruler with no myth, a name spoken only by those who remember what could have been. If only the boy had been born, if only the daughter had been different, if only the painter had been called. But no one called, and so she passed, unseen. Close your eyes now, and picture the history you were taught. The one with the golden-haired queen who stood alone and unwed, who defied popes and kings, who sent ships across oceans and defeated armadas with nothing more than wind and prayer and steel. Imagine the queen who spoke 5 languages, who wrote poetry beneath the moonlight, who turned her father's cruelty into a throne, forged from fire and solitude. That was Elizabeth. That was the legend. That was the world that was meant to be. But what if that world had never been? What if, instead of the phoenix, there had only been the ashes? What if the sharp, brilliant girl who might have ruled the world had died in silence before she ever became more than a danger? What if her head had fallen on the block in the spring of 1554? Her eyes wide and awake to the truth that she would never be remembered as anything more than a threat. What if her sister Mary, once only a broken daughter of a broken queen, had finally acted with ruthless certainty, and in doing so, had extinguished the light of the future before it ever reached the sky? That is the world we have just wandered through. A world where Jane Seymour gave birth to a daughter, not a son. A world where Queen Jane I ruled in the shadows of her sisters and died with no portrait, no husband, no heir, And no poem. A world where England forgot how to speak its own name with pride. A world that drifted, slowly and quietly, into irrelevance, not through failure or defeat, but through caution, through stillness, through the quiet choices that eroded greatness, grain by grain, year by year, breath by breath. In this version of history, there were no great queens, only long winters. No Shakespeare crafting the language of eternity, only silence where sonnets should have bloomed. No pirates turned patriots. No new worlds carved into maps by bold hands flying the flag of St. George. There were no Virginias, no golden ages, no defiance carved into legend. There were only councils, and compromises, and cold marriages to foreign princes who sent nothing back but instructions and indifference. And at the centre of this forgotten England, there stood a girl who never asked to rule, Jane, daughter of the woman who died, bringing her into the world. Jane, legitimate and unloved. Jane, the quiet queen who kept the peace by doing nothing to disturb it, who reigned by surviving, and survived by disappearing. She wore her crown like a borrowed veil, spoke softly so the realm would not shatter, and stepped carefully so the ghosts of her sisters would not wake. But even in this stillness, something lingers, not glory, not power, but a kind of haunting, because history is not only shaped by the bold, it is also shaped by the absent, by the roads not taken, by the songs not sung, by the queens who were never painted, the ships that never left port, the heirs who never came. Jane's reign, though bloodless and quiet, is still a wound, one that never bled, but never closed. A bruise on the body of a kingdom that once dreamed of greatness but chose caution instead. And yet, in that silence, there is a kind of lesson. Not all tragedies end in flames. Some end in sighs. Not all legacies are carved in stone. Some are buried in dust. And not all queens are remembered for what they did. Some are remembered for what they didn't. So tonight, let us remember her, not as a legend, not as a tyrant, not as a martyr, but as a girl who was asked to rule a country that had already begun to forget how to hope. Let us remember the world that never was the world without Elizabeth, without empire, without glory, and no, in some quiet, aching way, that history does not owe us triumph, it only offers possibilities, and sometimes, a single child born with the wrong name can shift the stars. Sleep now, beneath the weight of might have beens. Let the echoes fade, let the crown rest. The story is done, and in the hush that follows, may we remember not only what was, but what so nearly wasn't.